Hi, everyone. I'm Rabbi Susan Nanis, Director of Adult Programs, one of 9 rabbis at Wilshire Boulevard Temple. And it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our program, the 2024 election, 15 weeks out. So when we first planned this program, we had one thing in mind. And then when we met on Zoom on Friday, we had another thing in mind. And then over the weekend, everything changed again. But I know we're going to have a fascinating and really interesting conversation, after which we will open the floor so you can ask questions of our esteemed panelists, whom I will introduce right now. This is Professor Stephen Windmueller, who's an emeritus professor of Jewish communal studies at Hebrew Union College in LA. And during his tenure, he served as the director of its School of Jewish Nonprofit Management and dean of the LA campus. In 2009, he was named to an endowed chair, and in 2014 was awarded an honorary doctorate. He is the author of 4 books and numerous articles. He holds a PhD in international relations from the University of Pennsylvania. But probably most important, Stephen is a nationally known speaker and teacher and commentator, and he does research and speaks and teaches and analyzes Jewish communal trends, anti-Semitism, and Jewish political behavior. Please welcome Stephen Windmueller. Alex Cohen is the Emmy Award-winning political anchor at Spectrum News 1 and previously served as host of the nightly primetime show and weekly podcast, Inside the Issues with Alex Cohen. Prior to that, she was an anchor, host, and reporter at NPR, Marketplace, KPCC LAist, and KQED. She's also the co-author of the book, Down and Derby, The Insider's Guide to the Roller Derby. Please welcome Alex Cohen. Dan Schnur is a professor at the UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Public Policy, and the USC Annenberg School of Communications, where he teaches courses in politics, communications, and leadership. He is the founder of the USC LA Times statewide political poll, currently hosts a monthly webinar for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall, and writes weekly columns for the Jewish Journal and All Sides website. And now, if you want to read more of his commentary, you can go to his website, danschnurpolitics.com. Please welcome Dan Schnur. So instead of someone like me being the moderator, I'm leaving it to the experts. So Stephen is going to both moderate and comment, and let's get started.
Thank you, Rabbi, and good evening to all of you. Hopefully you can hear us clearly, and we will certainly try to endeavor to be as articulate as possible. This is 105 days out before the November 5th election. This is a year in which some 10 billion people around the world will be, 10 million people, around the world will be voting in different constituencies. And it will be a year in which we see the 60th president of the United States elected. During these last 10 elections, the elections were decided by 5% or less. They were contested elections in which we had the largest turnout of voters in 2020 that we've seen in all of the 20th century and into now the 21st century. It has been a period in which we have seen a huge transition of politics, as the shifts of political ideas and momentum have really altered and reshaped the American political scene. In so many ways, Jews are a part of this story. They are an integral part of the history of this nation, have been members and activists associated with governments at all different levels throughout the course of our tenure here over 250 years. Indeed, the first Jewish elected official to the Congress was in 1845 and to the Senate in 1851. And since then, We have seen 35 senators elected who are Jewish and 215 House members. We have seen an extraordinary turnout of Jewish voters, as Jews vote in exceptionally high numbers. Political scientists suggest to us between 72 and 85% of the eligible Jewish voters participate. What we also know is that Jews as a community are the oldest white ethnic religious body in terms of voting and participating in American politics. For example, here in California, 30% of our voters who are Jewish are 65 years of age and older. The statewide average is 19%. And that is true in Florida and Arizona and across the country. In reality, Jews live in very clear demographic areas. In fact, 75% of us live in 8 states. And those 8 states are obviously the ones that are dominant in terms of population: Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, Michigan, Florida, California, and the list goes on. What is also true is that the 10 most intensive or populated districts in which Jews live take place in only 7 states. And in those states, those 10 key districts are defining in terms of their importance. Rockland County, New York has 152,000 Jewish voters as part of one key congressional district. And the 17th congressional district in Florida, the Hollywood, Miami area, has an equal number of Jewish participants. So Jews are concentrated in a core set of states. Yet in this election and across the country, those voters in key critical battleground states will be significant. So the 2% of Jewish voters in Arizona, for example, or the 0.08% of Jewish voters in Georgia, or whatever the value added in North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, will be significant in terms of the outcomes of November's election. This is a unique story because Jews are also amongst the most activists of political players. At this moment, some 27 members of the House are Jewish and some 10 members of the Senate are Jewish. What is also key is that we have key elections coming up in North Carolina where one of the governors, one of those running for governor, is Jewish. A key state, Arizona, has an interesting election in Tucson with a young Jewish person challenging the existing incumbent. And likewise, we see in other states, including very key races in Colorado and certainly in Michigan, where we see in the Senate race the emergence of a Jewish candidate for the United States Senate in Michigan. In all of these and so many other storylines, the presence of Jews in American politics is profound. And our job tonight is to unpack all of that, what it means for us, what it means for this nation as we proceed to this incredibly important election. So, my fellow panelists, let's begin. Generations is a major issue. We see the battle lines between our generations. Younger voters and younger people either turned off or certainly in disagreement around Israel or Israeli policies, challenging the status quo. But generally, we see younger voters across the country expressing deep and major concerns with regard to this election and to the candidates and their choices. So how do you see the generation gap, the generational issues, now that we have some changing perspectives to this election, and what that all may mean for that generation, our history, and the role that we will see for this nation? Dan, would you like to begin?
Not really. First of all, I want to thank you all for letting us join you here tonight. I've had the privilege of participating in Wilshire programs at both of the other temples. This is my first time here since the transition, and it's absolutely gorgeous here. Fortunate to have not just a temple like this, but leadership like you do. And Susan and her fellow rabbis are just an extraordinary group of community and religious leaders. Let's start by giving them a round of applause for the good work that they do. I've always found that it's smart to flatter Susan because she's about to get really angry with me. After we did our planning call on Friday, this weekend was actually my wife's and my anniversary, truthfully. And so we decided to go out of town for the weekend when we really unplugged, and I just got back. So if anything's happened since Friday that would be helpful to talk about, I'll do my best. But jokes aside, when we talk about generations, and I was, jokes aside, going to talk about this in a much different way on Friday afternoon, but on Sunday morning at about 10:30 a.m. our time, the first thing I thought was L'Dor V'Dor. Generations give way to generations. And whether you intend to vote Democrat or Republican or Green or Kennedy in the fall, I think it's worth giving a moment to respect what must have been an excruciatingly difficult decision for the President of the United States to make, to step aside the way he did. And we'll talk more about the details of that going forward. But that type of generational change is inevitable in every part of our life. But to watch it happen at the absolute top level of our government was very arresting for me. And it put the framework of our generational discussion, Stephen, to me in a slightly different light. What I will add to this, and then we'll bring the conversation back, is that one of the challenges that I face in the classroom each day at Berkeley, at USC, at Pepperdine, are incredibly smart, is we're talking with incredibly smart young people who haven't been alive nearly enough. And this is something we face in the Jewish community. Some of us, when we think of Israel, we think of 1948. Some of us, when we think of Israel, my first memories are 1967 and 1973. For my younger relatives, they think of the early 2000s. And for a really brilliant 19 or 20-year-old in one of my classes, they think about just the last 10 months. And it's impossible for us not to come to different conclusions about the state of Israel, and not only its future, but its past. Because even if we've read its history, if we haven't experienced it, we're going to think about it in different ways. And I think the same challenge exists when it comes to American politics. I tell my students that the type of polarization and hyperpartisanship that has poisoned our politics today is not a given. I tell them about Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, a Republican president and a Democratic House Speaker, working together to save Social Security from bankruptcy. I tell them about Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, a Democratic president and a Republican speaker, working together to balance the budget. And I realize in telling these stories, I sound alarmingly like my grandparents telling me about the butter churn and the 8-track tape player. They don't doubt me, but it's an artifact of a different era. And it's unfair of us, to, on one hand, to ask them to understand something they've never experienced, but we still have an obligation to do our best to help them understand it so we can move forward. Alex?
I would also just like to share my thanks to be able to be here this evening at such a tremendous time in such a beautiful space to talk about these things face to face, which we don't do a whole lot in this era, which I hope we'll be able to talk about at some point tonight too. As a journalist, I recognize the value of being able to compartmentalize, right? When especially we're talking about voters in the elections, it is very easy for us to talk about women voters, men voters, young voters, older voters, Black voters, Latino voters, gay voters, because we like to be able to make sense of the world in some way. I also know as a journalist that's one of the biggest traps if you actually want to see the forest for the trees. And I think especially in this election, for example, you look at what we call the Latino vote, and we all do this. I can't tell you how many times I talk to people who say, this is not a homogenous voting bloc, but the Latinos, and it's crazy making. But the difference is in terms of people who are born in this country now, the first generation, and compared to the people who came years before, has a tremendous bearing on how you shape, how you view the issues of the day and how you view candidates. And I will say firsthand, coming from a Jewish family, and I'm in my 50s now, one of the things I love, I'm going to digress for a moment, one of the things I love about the past few days is that a 59-year-old person is being described as young. I've never heard that, and I'm loving it. But there is something about being in my 50s is that I don't know if I'm quite exactly halfway, but I do see things from both sides. I see the world through the eyes of my young children. I see through the world through the eyes of my older parents. And those are two very different worlds. And just as Dan said, how you view what is happening in this world, all around the world, is so very dependent on when you were born, what you have lived through. And the one other thing I will add is that how you are understanding what's happening in that world, which I think is probably one of the most, when the history books are written, will be one of the most critical factors in this moment that we're living through for elections across the board. I grew up, and I think it's probably safe to assume that most of the people in this room grew up getting information by reading it in a newspaper, which came out once a day. Maybe there was the evening edition. Turning into the television, which had a set schedule when you actually had to get up and change the channels. Hearing something on the radio. That is not how young people today are experiencing and learning about the world. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I actually think it's both and lots of other things. But I think without taking a moment to really recognize that almost everything right now, especially for Jewish voters, is very much a Rorschach test. And it can be the exact same image. And two voters within the same family who might have agreed about politics on everything until 2024 might see that image as completely different things. And I just think that's an important lens with which to have this conversation tonight.
No doubt, two critical issues for the Jewish community: anti-Semitism and Israel. And the American Jewish Committee study that was recently released indicated the huge numbers of American Jews, 95% indicating their concerns about anti-Semitism, and a significantly high number of American Jews as well being obviously concerned about Israel's security and its future. How do you see those issues and any other issues as particularly striking and essential for this election as we move forward?
It would have been so much easier to have this conversation on October 6th last year, wouldn't it? It's going to sound like I'm avoiding your question, but I'm not. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to read you something that Joe Biden wrote, not after Gaza, but this is something he wrote after leaving the vice presidency, right after Charlottesville in 2017. Biden wrote the following: "The giant forward steps we have taken in recent years on civil liberties and civil rights and human rights are being met by a ferocious pushback from the oldest and darkest forces in America. Are we really surprised they rose up? Are we really surprised they lashed back? Did we really think they would be extinguished with a whimper rather than a fight?" And so if we change a few of the words there and add the word Gaza, add the term anti-Semitism, we can ask the same questions. Did we really think those horrific forces, those ugly voices, would be vanquished and would retreat, whimpering without a fight? And I have to admit, just between the 120 of us, I have to admit I think I did. I thought we'd won that fight. And I take only small comfort in knowing that a lot of smart people I respect thought we did too. Not that anti-Semitism was gone completely, but had been pushed into the furthest and darkest corners and was really not the kind of issue and challenge that it once been. And we've learned over the last 10 months, sadly, that that's not the case. I think what we've learned on the American political landscape is that this kind of hatred is an exercise in bipartisanship. I was talking earlier about polarization. Well, you can take tiny bits of comfort in the fact that one horrible issue on which tiny factions in both parties can agree is that there's something about our people that they find unacceptable. And I feel, just I'm going to veer away from your question for a second, then come back to it if you'll give me the soapbox momentarily. I feel like if we are going to defeat these forces as a community, we have to decide that this battle is more important than the partisan fights that we face every day in secular elections. And we need to be willing to call out the ugliest and most hateful voices on the furthest extremes, not only of the other party, but of our own, because they're on both sides. In this election, and I say this, I think most of you know this, I was a Republican for many years. I switched my party registration to independent a long time ago. Ira Handelman still thinks I'm way too conservative, but I'm a sensible centrist. So I say this not as a partisan, but just as an observer. We've certainly seen over the last several months that while these tension exists in both parties, they are more visible and they are more impactful in the Democratic Party. And one thing I saw written in either the forward or the inside or just in the last couple days that I think was only a slight exaggeration was the supposition that Joe Biden could very well be the United States' last Zionist president. And that doesn't mean that we won't have presidents who support Israel in the past. But going back to your previous point, Stephen, about generational change, as a generation of political leaders take center stage, whose experience with Israel is different than a baby boomer generation, we need to realize that we're going to confront a different kind of challenges from our presidents and our Congresses in terms of both parties in the years ahead. And that the false sense of security that's developed in the United States since the early 1970s until now doesn't mean that we can't overcome these challenges. It doesn't mean that we can't win these fights. But we're about to enter an era where the debate over the Jewish community and over Israel on the political landscape is going to be much, much different in the 2030s and 2040s than it was in the late 20th and early 21st century.
Alex, would you like to offer some thoughts about anti-Semitism in Israel as key issues?
It's going to be a yes and after Dan probably all night tonight. I concur with everything he says. And I would add, so much of this year has been about the who, right? Who is running? Is it going to be Trump? Will anyone be able to unseat him? No. Who? Is it going to be Biden? Is it really going to be Biden? Is it going to be Biden after that debate? Oh my God, is it still going to be Biden? Okay, now it's looking like it's Kamala Harris, and we're still in that who moment, right? I mean, I think we're like right in the middle of it right now. And it's just certainly a very important question, of course. But I think that in all that discussion, all that focus, all that attention paid to the who, the why, the actual issues, the things that make a difference in an election or should make a difference in an election, it's not that they've been overlooked, but I think that they've been kind of cruising along in the back seat for a while. I think that's true of many different issues: immigration, the economy, the war in Ukraine, many of them. Now, let's talk a little bit about the situation in the Middle East, which we here, I think in Southern California, had a front row seat in terms of the impact that it was having. Look at what happened at UCLA. Look at what was happening at USC and our campuses. And then, because life is a very interesting drama in many ways, there was this almost giant pause button that happened because universities operate on a calendar which ends at a certain point in time. Those universities will resume weeks before the election. I don't know what that means. I know that means something. As we are speaking here tonight, when I last checked my phone, I think the number was up to 50 of Democratic members of the House and senators who have made the decision not to attend Netanyahu's speech tomorrow. There are images, which I'm sure many of you have already seen, of protesters in the Capitol. Donald Trump has invited Netanyahu to Mar-a-Lago, and my understanding is that a meeting will happen on Friday. Things are happening, and I know that something will come out of that. Will that be the most important issue in the election? It will not be the only one. But once again, I do this constantly, Dan. I don't know about you. I keep picturing the history book that is written, and I don't know who's going to do the best one or when it's going to come out, but I know that it's out there, and I know that someone's taking notes now. And I always just try to think, because as a journalist, I live very much in this moment. I live second to second, hour to hour of what's happening now. But understanding why and the context and what it will mean is a job for the historians. And there is no doubt in my mind that what is happening right now in the Middle East will have a huge bearing on it. Anti-Semitism, certainly connected to it, but I'm not sure as much. And I do think that, again, what has just happened remarkably in the past couple of days, when you have elected members of our government calling Kamala Harris not by her right name. She's been our vice president for years now. Not a single speaker. I watched the entire Republican National Convention. One speaker got her name correctly, and forgive me, I don't know who it was, and calling her a DEI hire, which she has now been called several times within the past couple of days. Everything that has been simmering and burbling in our country for some time now, it has had moments where it erupts full force. I am pretty certain that we are going to see the most base, raw, open conversation, clash, conflict, hopefully peace and resolution that we will have ever seen in our lifetimes happening right now. Maybe that's just me, and I don't like, and I will just be honest, that scares me sometimes. I lie awake a lot of nights going, oh my goodness, what kind of world are my children going to grow up in? But I also can see the hope in it as well. But these are, what was the old Betty Davis, buckle up, it's going to be a wild ride? Yes, it will be.
I think what is interesting as well with these two issues, anti-Semitism and Israel, is that historically, as we know, Jews have voted in fairly large numbers for Democratic Party candidates. Since 1912, Jews have historically and consistently voted Democratic, anywhere from 85 or 90% to a low of 40%, but that was in the election of Ronald Reagan versus Jimmy Carter in 1980, where President Carter received that particular lower level of Jewish support. What will that mean in this election? Republicans and Democrats are going to both be fighting to win the Jewish vote, with the concerns of Israel and anti-Semitism being very much in play. The Economist suggests that Donald Trump will score 37% of the Jewish vote. He received 23 to 25% in the past several elections. So the question is whether or not that will draw people to the right out of fear and concern, or whether they will return to their home base as traditional Democratic voters. But the interesting notion here is that these issues can be trigger issues in terms of how people will think about their vote and determine their outcomes. Dan, you mentioned earlier that you are an independent, and the fastest growing part of the American electorate are folks such as yourself, except most of them are younger than you.
I tend to be a trendsetter, though, in many regards.
And in fact, among young Jewish voters, we have a good deal of evidence to suggest that they're not identifying with either of the two major parties. Many of them are electing to register as independents, and there are going to be, by the way, 8 million new voters this time around. And 1/2 of those 8 million are folks of color, sort of reflective of the demographic changes we're seeing in the United States. And the fastest growing part of the American electorate are Asian Americans, just to sort of put all of that in perspective. So that this rise of independency is reflective not just of any one ethnic group, but is sort of a signal of what a generation and its perspective about where power and politics ought to go.
So I grew up in an era, and I believe that everyone in this room, with the possible exception of Rachel Wallace, grew up in an era in which there were 3 television networks, 5 buttons on the car radio, and 2 political parties. My students grew up at a time when, from their earliest sentient experiences, there have been an unlimited number, thousands, millions of options for them to receive information, entertainment, opinion, analysis, and so on. So we grew up in an era, most of us, in which we were used to a finite number of choices available to us. And so 2 political parties, while it frequently seems constraining, seems plausible. But if you are a younger person who's never had those kind of constraints in any other aspect of your life, the artificial binary choice presented to you by a Republican and Democratic Party, I think, is fundamentally unacceptable. And for young Jews, for young Latinos, for young Black and Asian Pacific Islanders, for young people of every racial and ethnic and religious background, we are watching them taking the first steps toward rejecting that first choice, that forced choice. And I suspect that when they move into positions of societal and political leadership, we will begin to see a multiple party system in this country, the way so many other countries do. But as long as us old guys are holding on, it's going to be just ours and D's.
I will, and I'm such a stickler for this, and it drives people nuts within my own newsroom. We do, when Stephen says independent, we all know what we mean. Truth be told, the American Independent Party, which is a party here in California, is a very different party. What you're really talking about technically is no party preference. And it takes more time to say. It doesn't roll off the tongue like independent, but I'm kind of a nerd, and 9 times out of 10, if you hear me on air, I will say no party preference, because I think it's important. I do actually think that the words matter, and what those words indicate, in my mind, is a little bit different than independent. It's, I don't prefer this, and I don't prefer that, and like Dan said, there is not one size fits all solution. I think when we're talking about the top of the ticket and this particular race, it's really interesting because I don't feel like either one of presumably our 2 candidates right now are necessarily one easily digested, this is exactly how you feel about this and why. Certainly, compared with both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, Donald Trump has very publicly had a much more pro-Israel stance. I think there's no doubt about it. And yet, I think the whys behind that is something that everybody should look into. Kamala Harris, even today, I was seeing reports that behind the scenes, there is talk of relatively soon establishing that she does not necessarily share the same stance that President Biden has on Israel, and that will be a hallmark of her campaign. I also know that she goes home every night to the first Jewish second gentleman that we've ever had, who has been, as probably most of you know, Doug Emhoff has made anti-Semitism that is his cause, that is his mission. I think, multiple times he's been out here meeting with the big Hollywood players to talk about how do we rewrite the narrative, because he sees that, and I agree, as one of the strongest ways to counter messages of hate. So what's the conversation like between Doug and Kamala at night? Like, that's just personally, I just sit there with a bucket of popcorn, right? Like, how are those 2 having that conversation, having that discussion, and really trying to thread the needle on trying to secure this vote, living up to your beliefs, and trying to navigate through all of this. There's a reason I love covering politics and I don't like being in it. These are not choices I would ever want to make, but they're really fascinating ones. And I think, watching to see what happens, what steps Kamala Harris chooses to make, given that she will likely, she will be the nominee, what does she do? How does she differ from President Biden? How then does the Trump-Vance ticket respond to that? Mike Johnson, who I feel got lost in the shuffle in a lot of this, is still very much there and Speaker of the House and has some real serious beliefs on all of this. How all of this plays out, I feel like, is the greatest HBO drama that is just begun. This is first season, episode 2, maybe.
We can keep going, but I think it's important that you also play a role in this conversation. And so Rabbi Nanas has a microphone and will be inviting questions, as we want to certainly draw from where you are.
Questions, not comments or speeches. Okay, Steve.
I have 2 quick questions. One of them is about no party preference. And could the growth of that in part be to a change in the rights of those people? When I was growing up, if you had no party preference, you had no say in the primary, in the candidates. And now in a lot of states, you can just pick and go vote how you want. And my second question, veering away again from Judaism and Israel, to what extent will another huge issue, and that being abortion and women's health, possibly make a huge difference given abortion is on the ballot in at least one swing state, and for an awful lot of people, I mean, I know there are a lot of Jews for whom it's Israel, but for an awful lot of people, that issue is transcendent.
Can I take on reproductive rights? Because that's such an important question, and thank you for that. And again, I'll go back to what we were saying earlier. It's stunning to me that as a woman, younger generations might have fewer rights than I do. That's just not ever a world that I witnessed or thought would happen. But that is a very real and very serious issue. I also want to say immigration, which again is one of those things like Mike Johnson. I feel, I hope no one thinks that I'm making light of it when I compare it to an HBO drama. But sometimes it's like Game of Thrones, right? And there's all these different lands and regions and whatever. And then all of a sudden this character is like, oh, Hodor, yeah, what happened to that guy? And he comes back, and right now, since the latest immigration reforms that President Biden has taken, June saw the lowest number of border crossings during his presidency, but who knows what happens, right, with all of this. And now, if you look at just the past 24 hours, if you look at Trump's Truth Social media platform, it's borders are, failed border policy, right? There is what the issues are, and there is also, I think, as much as the Democrats will say reproductive rights, abortion, the right will say immigration. And all of these issues are deeply important. In the end, I think it'll be a lot, going back to what Steve was saying in the beginning, and it is remarkable in a nation with millions of people that I think this one very much will be a nail biter, and it'll come down to a couple thousand, maybe a couple hundred, and what will it mean for each of those people? Because it probably will be. There's some extraordinary data when you look at, I think for Black women, I hope I'm getting this statistic right off the top of my head, that, reproductive rights for like a third of voters was one of the top issues. And it's a deeply, all of these issues, but especially ones like abortion and immigration are deeply, deeply personal issues. And I think it will be interesting, maybe a lot of you have seen the calls, the Zooms that have been happening. So on Sunday night, when President Biden steps aside, endorses Kamala Harris, there was it was originally, I think, supposed to be a FaceTime call. It wound up being a Zoom. There was a Black woman who was an employee of Zoom and got in touch with the CEO and said, we need to build a bigger room. In the end, it was upwards of 44,000 people who were on that call. Many of the people on that call had their phones up and were broadcasting it on YouTube channels and Twitch channels. It raised over $1 million in a matter of a couple of hours. I was on that call as a reporter. to monitor what was going on for a while, and it was pretty extraordinary. And I will say, it really gave me some insight into the role that I do believe women voters will play, and I do think reproductive rights will be absolutely.
Alex, I'm so glad that you raised the abortion issue in the context of immigration policy too, and I hope we can come back to that framing a little bit later. What I'll say for just now, before we get into this gentleman's question in more detail, while there are issues that are more important to the American people, primarily economic issues, I believe that those are the two issues that will define the outcome of this election. To the extent that Republicans can make more voters prioritize immigration rather than abortion policy, Donald Trump will be elected president. If Democrats can convince voters to prioritize abortion over immigration, Kamala Harris will. And I honestly do believe it's that simple. More specifically to your question, I'll just offer you a couple quick thoughts. Kamala Harris has some very impressive strengths as a candidate. She has some very notable weaknesses. I would argue that her greatest strength by far is her ability to articulate a message on behalf of reproductive rights in a way that Joe Biden, for any number of reasons, simply could not. And if because of her ability to do that, Harris is able to considerably raise the salience of the issue, if she's elected president in November, it will be because of the abortion issue. That's simple.
And her being a prosecutor.
Sorry?
And her being a prosecutor.
Oh, let's get into biography in a minute. But your question about the ballot initiatives in swing states, here's what we found, is I know many of you know, is a number of states, including several red states, have already put ballot measures up for a vote of the people and have voted virtually unanimously in favor of reproductive rights, even in deep red in Republican states. That said, there's research that's been done that shows that when voters cast an up or down, yes or no on an issue, they think much differently than when they consider that issue in the context of a candidate vote. So that's not me suggesting that the states that hold abortion, have abortion measures on the ballot this year will not be successful. Most of them will pass. But I don't think we can presume that that support for abortion rights as an issue on a ballot measure will automatically transfer to support for pro-choice candidates, because voters do weigh a number of issues when they make their decisions. And lastly on this, as you watch this issue play out over the next 105 days, one of the first lessons I learned in politics a trillion years ago is that angry voters are more likely voters. When things are going your way, you're much less likely to go to the trouble, to go to the polls to find your absentee ballot. But when you're really upset, that's when you want to do it. And so it shouldn't be surprising that from 1974 to 2020, more single-issue voters on the issue of abortion who are pro-life turned out to vote than pro-choice. 2022 was the first election since 1974, not surprisingly in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, where the majority of abortion single-issue voters were pro-choice and not pro-life. So what we'll see in this election is if that trend continues, as it did in 2020, with the spokespersons such as Harris leading the charge, then to me that increases the likelihood that abortion becomes the preeminent issue in November rather than immigration. Just real quick on the other question, no party preference is a mind-boggling term. No one knows what it means, and when you look at the ballot and you see NPP next to a candidate's name, it's untranslatable. That's intentional. Democrats and Republicans in the state legislature in Sacramento knew that if they allowed this party to be named independents, that could send an inspirational message to dissatisfied voters. Much better to have that nebulous acronym NPP to discourage votes in that regard.
Excuse me, Bob Wagmeister, there's an emergency, and if you would go with Hannah here, you need to call home.
I just want to tack on to the no party preference, because I think there's a big parallel here with what we saw at the Republican National Convention, a really extraordinary welcoming from Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, from so many speakers of we want everyone, we want it all. You know, you're welcome, right, and in the primaries, could no party preference voters participate? I think that the trouble, and look at all of the, I'm totally spacing on the name, there was that group that was the we're not left, we're not right, but then they could never find a candidate, forgive me.
No labels.
No no labels and not much sticking power in my brain either. I think the difficulty with no party preference is by who wants middle of the road right now? And I say this, I actually would love more middle of the road in our country, but if you look at our culture, look at what gets hits, look at what gets likes, look at what gets followers and deals and success. It is not anybody in the middle. And I think that's a real problem. It actually terrifies me. But if you look at everything in our culture right now, we are a culture of extremes. So when we think of no party preferences, I think many people would like to aspirationally as this, I want to take the best of both. I think there's a lot to that. I think it's a very hard sell in this current climate.
Well, I don't know that that's, I think you're exactly right. And I think it's more intense now, but I don't know that it's new. My very first boss in politics, and that was obviously many, many years ago, used to like to say, there's no such thing as a raging moderate. And going back to the point I was making earlier about how angry voters who feel like an issue is working against them are more likely to turn out on election day, I think the dynamic you're talking about, you know, is a pervasive one. But what we have seen in the history of American politics is these things work in cycles. In the 1950s, the American Association of Political Scientists, and yes, that organization actually exists, and yes, their conventions are just as boring as you would think they are, I can tell you. But the American Association of Political Science since the 1950s said that their single greatest concern about American democracy was that the two parties were too similar, and that the American people were being deprived of a legitimate set of choices and options between the two parties because they were so alike. So this does work in cycles.
Susan, we can go to the next question.
Yeah, if we can just go back a second to something that you said earlier. You mentioned that there's a substantial number of members of Congress who will be not attending Netanyahu's address. What are your thoughts on that, and how impactful is that?
It's a difficult one. I think, you know, like I said, everything has been put on pause for a while, and now it's coming back. And there are so many different factors that I think that these elected officials are weighing. I think a big one of those is the election itself. How does it reflect with your electorate, which varies very differently depending on your constituency. And I, you know, from the sentiments, I've read some of the statements, I've not read them all, but the belief that Netanyahu, that these folks have, that Netanyahu is acting incredibly irresponsibly, that he has blood on his hands, that this cannot continue, and that they don't, the vibe, for lack of a better word that I get, is that they don't want to give him the oxygen.
James Baker, when he was the Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush, used to say, if we only talk to our friends, nothing will ever change. And so I will admit I'm somewhat conflicted on this. If I were a member of Congress and the leader of North Korea or Iran was to speak before Congress, I would really have to wrestle with whether I wanted to show them the respect of attending their speech. I'd like to think that I would, but I can't say that with real confidence. But that said, as polarized and hyper-partisan as our society has become, for all the reasons that Alex was talking about earlier, I believe the women and men who we elect to office at every level, local, state, and federal, Democrat or Republican, progressive or conservative, have an obligation to represent the best of us. And I think they have an obligation from the left or the right to remind the rest of us that part of leadership is listening to and talking to people with whom we disagree. So I'm extremely disappointed that they're not going. But I'm also somewhat measured in knowing that if I were in the similar situation on the reverse, I hope I would behave better than they are going to behave tomorrow. I don't know if I would.
For the record, the Vice President will not be attending, but that is not out of any personal or ideological base. She has a prior commitment in Indianapolis at that time, and she's meeting with the Prime Minister privately at another occasion.
Hi. Just sort of piggybacking off that last question, you know, I'm 37 years old. I've voted in other presidential elections in my lifetime, but I can speak for a lot of people my age, at least in my immediate circles, who are waffling because they feel abandoned by the left. That over the course of the last 10 months and what we've witnessed, and just even on the Democrats just sort of, again, not necessarily showing a consistent voice backing Israel, that we see the alternative, which is abhorrent in its own way of, you know, moving and voting for Trump, but we feel that at this time that Israel needs as much support and backing as possible. What would you say, like, how does one reconcile that, you know, basically caring about, you know, feeling that Israel needs as many supporters during this time, but at the same time not voting for, you know, what could potentially have so many other negative ramifications for this country?
Look, there are a lot of advantages of a parliamentary system of government. I watched the British elections recently with great jealousy. The biggest advantage, I think, of our system as opposed to a parliamentary one is you have the ability to vote for individuals, not for parties. And a really smart, intelligent individual like you can say, I am going to vote for these Democrats who are strong supporters of Israel and these Republicans who are strong supporters of Israel. And whether you happen to be a fan of AIPAC or not, I believe that that's a model that's worked very effectively for the U.S.-Israel relationship for many years, supporting candidates of both parties who stand with Israel. I think where we get into a trap as a community is because we're part of such a polarized and hyper-partisan society, we all feel that overwhelming pull from our preferred party, whether it's Democrat or Republican. We know from research, and Stephen can talk to this much more authoritatively than I can, we know that for roughly 20 years now, Israel has not been the primary voting issue that motivates Jewish Americans to go to the polls. And it's been about a generation since that shift took place. For those of us for who that is the most important issue, I think we have not just the ability, but an obligation to say, I will only vote for candidates in primaries and general elections who are willing to express a position on the safety and security of Israel and the future of the Middle East that meets my satisfaction. And if that means that I anger my friends in the Democratic or Republican Party because I'm with them only some of the time instead of all of the time, that's a price I'm willing to pay in order to make sure that Israel continues to survive and continues to thrive. I know it's not anywhere near that simple, but they're going to kick us out of here in a little while, so that's the best I can do.
I think what we're going to see in Chicago is a very messy situation related to the Israel platform. And the street, meaning what's going to be happening outside the convention, will be as problematic as what may happen as well inside. So it's, as Dan has suggested, I think it's sort of picking and choosing allies and pro-Israel friends when and where those are available to us.
And I know that you're a millennial and not Gen Z, but you guys could start those third parties too. And if that third party happens to have Chuck Schumer and Amy Klobuchar and Mitt Romney and Susan Collins, count me in.
We keep talking about Israel as a constant. We forget that it's not the Israel of yesterday. It's not my Israel when it's Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And I think people keep using the term pro-Israel. I consider myself pro-Israel, the state of Israel, but the current government and the policies they're inflicting on their own and on the Palestinians is abhorrent. And yet, we keep talking about Israel. Dan, you say the generations keep changing their view of Israel as if Israel is a constant. Israel's changed. It's not the Israel of 20 years ago. It's not the Israel of 30 years ago. I wish when we talk about it, we'd talk about that more than just Israel, pro-Israel, anti-Israel. It's much more complicated.
Well, I think you make a very valid point, Ira, and what I should have clarified is that the reason each generation looks at Israel differently is because Israel is a different place. It was a different place in 1973 than it was in 1948. It was a different place in 1990 than it was in 1973. It was a different place in 2012 than it was. You get my point. So you're exactly right. And I should apologize. When I use the term pro-Israel, it's like me using the term independent. I'm trying to move the conversation along a little bit more quickly than I should. But I think you raise an incredibly important point. Being pro-Israel is a much more complicated question for all of us today than it was in the past. And there's a separate panel to be had, hint, hint, on that particular topic. But I didn't intend to suggest that Israel's place in the world, its status, its capabilities, its threats, its opportunities are identical today to where they were in 1948. And if it came across that way, I apologize.
And I want to just add, I think that's true of almost everything. I mean, my job as a journalist, and I don't always do it perfectly, is to try to figure out what are all the perspectives, what are all the sides. When I'm at home in the privacy of my own family, I have really strong feelings about all sorts of things, right? And as a person and a journalist and a voter, I always try to hold some space for, even if I don't agree with it, the person who is coming from the most diametrically opposed position that I am, why do they feel that way? And I think you're absolutely right when we say Israel or abortion or parental rights or immigration or any of these things. There's kind of that top level understanding that we all have of what that means. But I guarantee you, I have yet to meet an issue where it's ever that 100% cut and dried, right and wrong, I feel this way, don't feel that way. And I'm grateful for that because I like to believe that we're all human beings with some shred of decency and humanity in our hearts. And even if that we disagree so vehemently on some topics, that there is some place for meeting ground, even on these issues, which are some of the most difficult, violent, bloody of them all. There must be, all of these mothers and fathers worried about their babies. We all love our babies. We all want our babies home safely, but we've just moved so far away from that. So I'm always a big proponent of trying to find that space.
Stephen, what are the statistics about American Jews in terms of the support of Israel and Americans in terms of their support of Israel right now, if you have those numbers?
Well, the interesting thing is, despite all that we've seen on campuses and all that we are experiencing even in the general public sphere, Americans are still overwhelmingly supportive of Israel. Yes, the numbers have declined, and younger Americans are less supportive, for sure, and that is a major sort of red flag. But we do have good data that the vast majority of Americans still see Israel as a critical ally, as a democracy, and as certainly a U.S. Friend. American Jews are splintering on a lot of these topics, for sure. But it's not about the question of whether there should be an Israel, at least not for those 35 and over. Younger Jews, the question of Zionism and being a Zionist, being supportive of Israel, has become a very real issue. We've seen that sadly, in real-life terms and real actual terms this last 9 months in the context of various events, both on the university level, but also in letters prepared by many of the sons and daughters of leading voices and figures in American Jewish life who are critical of Israel and questioning their Zionism and questioning the state's sort of status and standing. So it is an internal Jewish challenge, which we certainly have.
Thank you. Wanted to hear from a woman.
Okay, so I'm a little younger than you. I'm 30. Well, what do you think about the fact that I'm seriously 30? But what do you think about the fact that people my age, not Gen Z, still millennial, what do you think about the fact that one, birthright existed for us in my lifetime, and two, what about the fact that we have access to Holocaust survivors in our lifetime to actually speak to us? So what do you think about the fact that I'm learning from the top down? I'm learning from Holocaust survivors. I'm watching my parents. I'm watching your varying ages, and I'm getting information within the Israeli news, so I have access to tons of information. How do you think that will shape young Jewish voters?
I think, first of all, I give you an immense amount of credit because it's clear that you're seeking out that information. And so I'll broaden for just a moment from young people to old people and from Jews to everyone. If we had been told 20 years ago that most human beings on this planet could walk around with the full amount, with every piece of information that has ever existed in the history of the planet Earth, that we could walk around with access to all that information in our pockets, we would be an incredibly brilliant society, wouldn't we? But just because we have access to that information, and this goes back to a point that Alex was making earlier about digital and social media, just because we have access to this information doesn't mean we choose to access it. And I give you an immense amount of credit because it sounds like you make the choice to access it. Now, I sit on the board of the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles, and one of the things that we spend a great deal of time talking about is the time, sadly, in the not too distant future, when there will no longer be any survivors for us to hear these stories from firsthand. And there'll be recordings, and there'll be records, and there'll be evidence, but there's going to be something different. And I think even for the most committed of students, learning something secondhand almost can never have the same impact of experiencing it yourself. And so while I believe that young leaders like you will not only keep these memories alive, but keep this conversation framed in ways that are going to be helpful, not only to our community, but more broadly, I think it's going to be a much greater challenge for your generation than it has been for mine, because the information is that much, is one step further removed. What I will say to the fellow Gen Xers and Boomers in the audience, I think we could be doing and could have done a much better job on this. I have a friend by the name of Zach Bodner who runs the JCC in Palo Alto. And I'll just tell you that if you ever happen to be up there, it is the most gorgeous JCC I have ever seen in my entire life. When I grew up and reeked of chlorine, this is the Taj Mahal of JCCs. But the reason I bring it up is he gives a very powerful talk, and I know, Stephen, you and I have talked about this, which he talks about the dichotomy that Stephen raised between younger members of the Jewish community who care deeply about their religion and their culture, but tend to be much more ambivalent on the more complicated questions relating to Israel. And what Zach points out is that shouldn't be any surprise, because we do a wonderful job. We devote extraordinary amounts of time and effort and energy to making sure that our children and grandchildren learn about biblical Israel. And we're scared to teach them about contemporary Israel. So they learn about Abraham and Moses and David. They don't learn about Ben Gurion and Golda and Sharon and Rabin. And if you think about it, if we take that much time to make that much effort to teach them about the distant reaches of our heritage, and don't make the effort to teach them about the more recent complicated issues that I alluded to a moment ago, it shouldn't surprise us that we've raised a generation of young Jewish people who do care deeply about their faith, about our culture, about our heritage, but are much more conflicted when it comes to Israel. It shouldn't be surprising at all.
Can I just add too, the way that Dan describes it, could you imagine a world where there's this little thing in your pocket that gives you all the answers? Yeah. The thing that frightens me, and I hope that this doesn't, I am a journalist, so I think about these things a lot. I think probably most people in this room know what is happening to my industry right now. It is being decimated, and I wish I could say I'm being dramatic or histrionic. When I used to work in public radio, yes, I put on that, you have to give now and get your tote bag or it's all gonna fall apart. It's falling apart. It is. And it's very terrifying because we've all seen, and tell me like a person in this room that didn't see an image on Instagram or read something on Twitter that looked like something happened only to find out that's not who dropped the bomb. That's not exactly where that was. We live in a world where misinformation and disinformation is so prevalent, and there are so few guardians working against that right now. That's what I worry about much more so. People have come and gone and lived and died in chapters of history. That's humanity, baby. But this stuff is very new. And to me, it's very, very, very terrifying because I think it creates a whole real twisted lens on things that makes it hard for people to get a sense of what is actually happening out there. And sadly, that is the one thing I don't have. So I got a lot of thoughts and solutions of things we can do. This is one where I panic. I feel like I own a Kodak camera shop, and I might be able to keep the doors open today, but I don't know if we can keep them open much longer.
So we'll just have one last question.
I ask myself this constantly. I can't answer it. So the three of you, I hope that each of you can answer. Alex, earlier you said, on the same topic that we've been discussing, Trump, and you made it sound like it was a given, a fact, Trump is more pro-Israel. I don't understand it. I know that's the message that's in the media. We personally have friends who are very intelligent, very well-educated people, but that's their issue. They cannot vote what Joe Biden, and we haven't spoken to them to know. Yeah, we actually have. Can't vote for Kamala, can't vote Democratic. Some are voting Trump, shockingly, or they're not voting at all. How is Donald Trump more pro-Israel, other than the fact that he says it, just like he says he won the election and says many other things? How is it? He moved to the embassy. My opinion, very foolish thing to do. How else? What has he done? He does not believe in a two-state solution. What does he believe in? Where is the truth in that?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. And I will just say it has been, I think Trump is one of the most masterful, not just politicians, but really marketers. And I actually do say this with great respect because, and again, I watched every single minute of the Republican National Convention, and I watched so many people try to do what he could do, and the only person who came close was a guy whose wrestling name is Hulk Hogan. And everyone just calls him Hulk Hogan like that's his real name. It is a show. And I actually think a very prominent member of the Jewish Hollywood community, who I will not name, I spoke with this person about a week after Donald Trump was elected in 2016.
You know, I have to stop this because I don't really want to get into discussing Trump because this temple just doesn't do that. It's
Okay.
the question. It's
Susan,
not-
maybe I can do this.
Just- I don't mean to be rude, but we have a policy, and there's a lot of people on every side of the spectrum here, and to sort of focus on one candidate or another, it's just not good for the temple.
Susan, let me see if I can do this in a way that doesn't violate the understandable guidelines of the temple. As I mentioned earlier, I worked in Republican politics earlier in my career, and I still have some friends in the party, and they have been asking me for years, for decades, why don't more Jews vote Republicans? And Trump, yet again today, and I'm not taking sides here, he said, I think every Jew should vote for me, because I am so pro-Israel. Quickly, I think his argument would be that because he more reliably and unquestionably supports the current leadership of Israel, that makes him more pro-Israel. That would be his definition. Whether any of us agree with it or not is not relevant. But I'd say more broadly, so these Republicans say to me, we're better on Israel than the Democrats are, which means they see themselves as more supportive of Israeli leadership than Democrats. Why don't more Jews vote for us? And I point out two things to them. One, as we said earlier, it's been a generation since the majority of American Jews prioritized Israel as their top voting incentive. And I said, second, I said, if you had two parties in which one party was great, phenomenal, amazing, wonderful on Israel, and one party was absolutely horrible, inexcusable, just ridiculously horrific on Israel, that would be one thing. I said, but for those American Jews who buy your argument that you are more consistently supportive of Israeli government leadership than Democrats are, their equation is, well, one party is really, 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 really good on Israel. The other party is really, 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 really good on Israel. So I'm going to go ahead and vote on other issues that are important to me. The one last point I'd make, since I've got the microphone, Susan, if you'll let me, because I think it's so important as it relates to the first question that Stephen raised about both Israel and the Jewish community. I'll offer you this. And to me, this is our central challenge on both fronts. Our challenge in the Middle East, in which I think there is a path toward resolution, and the path here, which is going to be more difficult, but one where we can reach our goals also, but it will be more difficult. But in both cases, when we're talking about the Jewish state and we're talking about Jews in America, I would offer you a theory that I will call the David syndrome. We think we're David standing up against Goliath. We're the underdog. And we have some validity for that belief. We've been David for millennia, for thousands of years now. We have the credentials to prove it, right? But in the immediate, in contemporary America and the contemporary Middle East, we think we're David. The majority of observers see us as Goliath. And if Goliath shows up at David's house and says, hey, I'm David too, David doesn't know what to do with that because they don't see us that way. And if the first thing we tell an American or an international observer is that we're David, that we're the underdog, and that doesn't jibe with the reality that they see either in this country or in the Middle East, we have almost immediately lost all the credibility we need in order to engage in further conversation to build support for the goals that we've been talking about tonight. We're not going to resolve this tonight, but the wonderful thing about gatherings like this, and the terrific thing, jokes aside, the terrific thing about Susan and her colleagues for allowing us to gather to talk about them, my suggestion to you and to your friends and your neighbors and the people with whom you worship here is let's have a conversation on our own community about how we can demonstrate to those people who think we're Goliath and help them understand the path that we have tread all these years and all these generations. Because if the first thing we say to the rest of the world is we're David, we're the plucky little underdog, not only are they not going to listen to anything else we're going to say, they're not going to believe anything else we say. And I would argue to you that that's the first step, whether specifically on the political landscape during a presidential election or more broadly in our communities here in West LA. That's our first and most important step toward having the conversation that we need to have to get back to where we need to be.
And if I could just, I really want to be incredibly clear because this is on public record. In the same way that I would never tell you who to vote for or how, or who I think is better, not just for Jews, but for Muslims or Christians or Buddhists or Sikhs or anybody else. I might have my own personal opinions. That is not the place for us. Where I was getting with this is we like to think of leaders as who is the person that is taking this country to a better place. I think that's a common definition. That's the one we'd like to believe. In many ways, American politics now, a leader is the person who can lead you to believe the thing that they want you to believe. And that is not just true of Donald Trump, that is true of every single politician that has ever existed. He is masterful in it in a way which is, it is really extraordinary, and I think comes from his background, that he came from the world of television and business and like, you know, we also have this template in our mind of that the great American president is this, that, or the other thing, or comes from these roots. If you want to look at the way that politics and our political system works, it is not a game by any means, but gamesmanship is crucial. And I think he's exceptionally masterful of it. And when people ask me, why did Trump win in 2016 when nobody thought he was going to win? My answer to that was because when he said he was running for president, the media, the smart media, the NPRs and the New York Times laughed, and they didn't take him seriously. And regardless of what you think or what your politics are, that was a grave mistake. So to say, how can people believe this, is the wrong question, and I think it's a dangerous question. There are a lot of different beliefs out there. And again, I go back to that, look at that why. When you say, how can my friend possibly think this? Find out why. Because that, I guarantee you, that person has very legitimate reasons to them, whatever they might be. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Stephen, would you like to have a final comment?
So this will be the most expensive election in American history. Barack Obama's election in 2008 cost each candidate $2.5 billion. This election will cost American taxpayers and the American political establishment over $10 billion. This will be an election in which many people are saying they are going to sit it out. But in reality, this may be an election which will define American democracy in all different ways. It is an election that will bring a number of new ideas into play. We will hear the term Christian nationalism. We will see the term populist. We will understand the idea of national conservatism, which is not the traditional conservative philosophical principles. We will see postmodernism and hear about intersectionality and critical race theory. We will be seeing terms and ideas that are fundamentally different from what we have understood as core to the American political game. But that is why this election, and so much about it, not only its candidates, but we the voters, have so much to say. Thank you to my two colleagues and to Rabbi Nahman.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks to all our colleagues. Thank you so much.